Listen closely. The rules you were taught to obey were written by people who stand to gain from your obedience. Niccolò Machiavelli warned that sometimes you must bend the game not because you are cruel, but because you are lucid. Justice tends to protect the rule makers, not the rule followers. If you honor systems designed to limit you, you consent to lose under terms that are not yours. Results, not intentions, decide who speaks and who is silenced. Success rewrites methods into wisdom. Failure, even when dressed in virtue, remains failure in the eyes of history. Strategy is therefore not amorality. It is clarity, timing, and disciplined action. If you want real control, stop pleading for fairness and start shaping outcomes. Just 5 explicit, actionable lessons that turn that clarity into power. 1. Asymmetric strategy beats naive fairness play straight when it serves your objective. Break or bend rules when the situation demands it. Not out of cruelty, not out of corruption, but out of clarity. Most people are raised to believe that fairness is the highest principle in every situation. They are taught that if everyone plays honestly, the most deserving person will eventually win. But real life rarely functions like a classroom exercise. In many environments, the rules are not neutral. They are written, interpreted, and enforced by people who already hold power. This is the first moment where strategic awareness must appear. A strategist does not blindly obey every rule simply because it exists. He first asks a deeper question. Who benefits from this rule? Who created it? And what happens to the person who follows it without thinking? Often, rules are designed to keep the majority predictable. Predictable people are easy to manage. When everyone follows the same path, the system becomes stable for those who control it. But the strategist studies the structure of the game before deciding how to move within it. This does not mean becoming dishonest in every situation. On the contrary, playing straight can be extremely powerful when it strengthens trust, reputation, or alliances. Integrity can be a strategic asset when it builds credibility over time. But the key difference is intention. The naive person follows rules automatically. The strategist follows rules selectively. He knows when discipline creates long-term advantage, and when rigid obedience quietly limits his potential. Imagine a competitive environment such as business, politics, negotiation, or even everyday social interactions. Most participants restrict themselves to what they believe is acceptable behavior. They operate inside invisible boundaries they never question. This creates an interesting, dynamic dot when everyone plays within strict limits. The person who understands the limits can step outside them at the precise moment when it creates advantage, not recklessly, not constantly, but strategically. In this sense, bending the rules becomes a form of awareness rather than rebellion. The individual who is willing to think beyond rigid frameworks gains access to possibilities others never even consider. While others wait for permission, he moves. While others fear breaking convention, he studies where convention becomes weakness. This is what the text calls lucidity. Lucidity means seeing the structure behind appearances. It means recognizing that fairness is often a story societies tell themselves to maintain order. And while order can be useful, it does not automatically guarantee justice. A lucid strategist, therefore, develops a dual capacity. He can operate within the rules when doing so builds stability, reputation, and cooperation. But he is also capable of stepping outside those rules when the environment rewards initiative and flexibility. Consider how this principle applies in society. In business, companies that strictly follow traditional models often lose to innovators who redefine the rules of the industry. In politics, leaders who understand timing, perception, and strategy frequently outperform those who simply rely on moral arguments. In negotiations, the person who understands the psychological limits of the other party often shapes the outcome before the discussion even begins. The advantage does not come from chaos. It comes from awareness. The strategist understands that rules are tools, not chains. He studies them. He respects them when they serve his interests. But he never confuses obedience with wisdom. This is the essence of cunning intelligence in society. Cunning is not blind manipulation. It is disciplined perception. It is the ability to see patterns that others ignore and to move where others hesitate. The world often rewards those who understand its hidden mechanisms. Those who refuse to see them may remain morally satisfied, but strategically powerless. A great strategist, therefore, cultivates three qualities. First, observation. He studies environments carefully before acting. He notices incentives, hierarchies, and invisible pressures. Second, timing. He knows that breaking a rule at the wrong moment destroys credibility, while bending a rule at the right moment can create opportunity. Third, control. He never acts impulsively. Every deviation from the norm is calculated and purposeful. When these qualities are combined, a person stops reacting to the system and begins shaping his position inside it. This does not mean abandoning principles. It means understanding that principles must coexist with intelligence. Strategy without ethics becomes chaos, but ethics without strategy becomes weakness. The strategist seeks balance. He respects order when order serves progress. He challenges limits when limits block growth. And by developing this mindset, he stops being merely a participant in the game. He becomes someone who understands how the game is played, how the rules are used, and when stepping beyond them creates the path to victory. 2. Rules and justice usually serve the rule makers, not the rule follower. Systems of justice, laws, and social norms are often presented as neutral structures designed to protect everyone equally. In theory, they promise fairness, stability, and order. But in practice, these systems are rarely neutral. They are created, shaped, and enforced by individuals or groups who hold power, and naturally, those structures tend to protect the interests of the people who built them. This does not mean that laws or institutions have no value. Societies need rules to function, but a clear-minded observer must understand an important reality. Rules are not born in a vacuum. They are written within a context of power, negotiation, and strategy. The people who design the framework usually understand how it benefits them. Those who simply obey it without reflection often accept limitations that were never meant to serve them. A strategist begins by recognizing this imbalance. Instead of assuming that every rule represents universal justice, he studies who created the rule, why it was created, and who truly benefits from it. This awareness alone changes how one moves through society. Rather than behaving like a passive participant who blindly follows instructions, the strategist becomes an observer of systems, patterns, and incentives. In practical life, this means learning to look beyond appearances. In business, for example, regulations and corporate structures often appear neutral, yet they frequently favor those who already possess resources, influence, or connections. A strategic mind studies these dynamics carefully. Instead of complaining about unfairness, he asks a more productive question. How does this system actually operate, and where are the opportunities within it? In professional environments, this awareness can be the difference between stagnation and progress. Some people assume that hard work alone guarantees recognition. Yet organizations often reward visibility, alliances, and strategic positioning just as much as effort. A person who understands this learns to combine competence with intelligent positioning. He develops relationships, understands internal power dynamics, and communicates his value in ways that cannot be ignored. The same principle applies to social influence. Norms and expectations often pressure individuals to behave in predictable ways. Society praises conformity, because it maintains stability. But the strategist recognizes that excessive conformity can quietly limit personal growth. He studies expectations, but he does not allow them to define the boundaries of his ambition. Instead, he decides which norms serve his long-term goals and which ones merely restrict his freedom. Applying this mindset requires discipline. It is not about rebellion for its own sake. Reckless defiance of every rule is not strategy. Strategy requires clarity, patience, and awareness. The strategist understands when to cooperate with a system and when to maneuver within it more creatively. Sometimes the smartest move is to appear cooperative while quietly advancing your own position. Sometimes the wiser choice is to step outside a restrictive structure and build a new path entirely. History repeatedly shows that individuals who change systems first learn how those systems function. They observe the incentives, identify weaknesses, and understand the psychology of those who enforce the rules. Only then do they act. Their actions appear bold to others, but they are usually the result of careful observation and calculated timing. For someone seeking real influence in society, the lesson is simple but powerful. Do not approach life as a passive follower of rules written by others. Study the framework. Understand the interests behind it. Learn how power, incentives, and perception shape decisions around you. Once you see clearly how systems operate, you gain a form of freedom that many people never experience. You are no longer limited to reacting within boundaries that someone else defined. Instead, you begin to think like a strategist. You choose your moves deliberately, position yourself intelligently, and create opportunities where others see only restrictions. In the end, real power does not come from blindly obeying structures. It comes from understanding them deeply enough to navigate them wisely. The person who learns to observe, adapt, and act with strategic clarity gradually moves from being controlled by systems to learning how to influence them. And that shift is where true agency begins. 3. Results determine morality and legitimacy far more than method. Society often presents itself as a moral teacher. It publicly condemns ruthless tactics, harsh decisions, and calculated strategies. In speeches, in schools, and in public debates, we are told that integrity, kindness, and fairness are the highest virtues. People applaud these ideals because they sound noble and reassuring. But if you observe reality carefully, a very different pattern appears. In practice, society does not reward intentions. It rewards results. A person who fails while remaining perfectly virtuous is rarely admired for long. People may express sympathy for a moment, but eventually the story fades. Failure, even when wrapped in morality, remains failure in the collective memory. Meanwhile, the person who succeeds through difficult, controversial, or highly strategic decisions often ends up being praised. Once the victory is secured, the narrative changes. What once looked ruthless begins to look necessary. What once seemed manipulative begins to look brilliant. Success rewrites the interpretation of the method. Centuries ago, this uncomfortable reality was observed clearly by Machiavelli. His analysis of power did not focus on how people wish the world to function. It focused on how power actually operates in human societies. And one of the most important lessons is simple. People judge actions largely by their outcomes. History rarely records the internal motives of individuals. It records what happened. The victor's decisions are studied, analyzed, and often praised. The defeated person's intentions disappear with him. This creates a powerful incentive structure within society. People may publicly defend moral purity, but when real decisions must be made, results become the ultimate measure of legitimacy. Understanding this reality does not mean becoming immoral or cruel. It means becoming lucid. It means recognizing that the world often functions according to practical consequences rather than ideal principles. A strategic mind, therefore, learns to ask a different question. Most people ask, is this action perfectly pure? The strategist asks, what will this action produce? That shift in perspective changes everything. When you begin to think strategically, you stop measuring actions only by how they appear in the moment. Instead, you measure them by their long-term effects. You evaluate systems, incentives, and power structures before deciding how to act. For example, in professional environments, many individuals believe that simply working hard and following every rule will guarantee advancement. Sometimes this works, but often promotions go to those who understand influence, timing, and negotiation. The person who learns how the structure really operates often moves further than the person who simply obeys every expectation. The same pattern appears in politics, business, and social dynamics. Those who understand incentives, leverage, and human psychology are able to navigate complex environments more effectively than those who rely only on moral hope. This is why strategic thinking becomes a crucial skill. A strategist observes before acting. A strategist studies incentives before trusting appearances. A strategist understands that every system contains hidden rules beneath the visible ones. Instead of asking, what should I do according to ideal theory? The strategist asks, what action will create the desired outcome? This does not mean abandoning ethics. It means refusing to confuse ethical intentions with effective strategy. In society, many people become trapped because they accept every rule exactly as it is presented to them. They assume that if a rule exists, it must exist for everyone's benefit. A strategist understands that rules are often created by those who already hold power. Some rules maintain order. Others maintain advantage. Learning to distinguish between the two is essential. When you develop this awareness, you begin to move differently through society. You stop reacting automatically. You begin analyzing structures. You notice who benefits from certain narratives and who is expected to simply comply with them. Gradually, you begin playing the game with greater control. Instead of being constrained by systems you barely understand, you learn to navigate them intelligently. You recognize when cooperation is beneficial and when independence is necessary. You understand when patience is strategic and when decisive action is required. This is what it means to think like a strategist. And when a person truly develops this mindset, one final realization becomes clear. The world will always speak about morality, ideals, and fairness. Those concepts are important, but they do not always determine outcomes. In reality, outcomes shape how actions are remembered. Success is often interpreted as wisdom after the fact. Failure, even when honorable, rarely receives the same recognition. That is why the most important question a strategist asks before acting is not simply whether an action appears noble in theory. Decisive question is far more practical. Does it work? Because in the real world, intentions may be discussed, but consequences are what endure. 4. Intentions and process matter little. Consequences shape reality. History rarely remembers pure intentions. It remembers outcomes. Leader may speak beautifully about morality, honesty, and noble principles, but if his actions lead to defeat, history will not celebrate his virtue. It will record his failure. Meanwhile, another individual may take difficult, even controversial decisions, but if those decisions produce victory, stability, or power, the world eventually calls him wise. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about human societies. An act considered questionable when it fails suddenly becomes strategic when it succeeds. A decision condemned as ruthless may later be praised as visionary once its results become undeniable. Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli observed this pattern clearly. He noticed that societies tend to judge actions less by their intentions than by their consequences. The victorious leader writes the narrative that later generations accept as truth. Understanding this reality is the beginning of strategic thinking. A great strategist does not move blindly according to abstract ideals alone. He studies outcomes, incentives, and human behavior. He understands that the world rewards effectiveness far more consistently than it rewards good intentions. This does not mean abandoning morality entirely. It means recognizing that moral language often hides the real mechanics of power. In politics, in business, and even in everyday social dynamics, the individuals who shape events are rarely those who simply hope for fairness. They are those who understand how decisions translate into results. If someone wants to become a true strategist, he must begin by changing the way he interprets events around him. Instead of asking only, was this action morally pure? He must also ask, what result did it produce? And who benefited from that result? When you observe society with this lens, patterns begin to appear everywhere. In business, companies that dominate markets are not always those with the most ethical slogans. They are those that execute strategies effectively. They understand timing, leverage, and positioning. In politics, leaders who secure stability or victory are remembered as strong, even when their decisions were controversial in the moment. Meanwhile, leaders who act with perfect moral consistency but fail to protect their nations are quickly forgotten. The same logic applies in everyday life. People who control outcomes gain influence. People who merely explain their intentions lose authority. This is why a strategist focuses on consequences. First, he thinks several steps ahead before acting. He analyzes incentives, risks, and potential reactions. He understands that every decision creates a chain of effects that eventually determines whether his position becomes stronger or weaker. To apply this thinking in society, a strategist must cultivate several habits. First, he must observe more than he speaks. Most people reveal their motivations through patterns of behavior, not through the moral language they use publicly. Second, he must separate appearance from reality. What people claim to value and what actually drives their decisions are often very different. Third, he must think in terms of leverage. Every situation contains hidden forces, incentives, fears, ambitions, reputations. The strategist learns to recognize these forces and position himself where they work in his favor. Fourth, he must learn to judge actions by their consequences. If a strategy consistently produces results, it deserves study, even if it initially appears uncomfortable. This mindset does not make someone cruel. It makes him lucid. The strategist understands that justice, as an abstract idea, is often flexible in practice. Laws, institutions, and moral standards are interpreted differently depending on who holds power. But consequences are rarely flexible. If a decision strengthens your position, increases your influence, or protects your long-term goals, its impact becomes real and measurable. If a decision weakens you, no amount of moral explanation can erase the damage. This is why history tends to reinterpret actions after the outcome is known. Victory transforms necessity into wisdom. Defeat transforms virtue into naivety. A strategist, therefore, learns to operate with clarity. He accepts that the world is not governed only by ideals, but by incentives, interests, and outcomes. Instead of waiting for fairness, he builds positioning instead of trusting appearances. He studies patterns. Instead of hoping intentions will be rewarded, he ensures that his actions produce results. This is the heart of power. The individual who understands consequences gains the ability to influence events. He becomes someone who anticipates reactions rather than merely responding to them. And once you begin to think in this way, society itself becomes easier to read. You start seeing how decisions are shaped, how narratives are constructed, and how authority emerges. At that point, you are no longer simply participating in the system. You begin to understand how the system itself works, and that understanding is the first step toward real strategic control. 5. To gain real control, adopt the strategist mindset over the moralist one. If you want to write your own rules, instead of obeying those of others, think like a strategist. Act with clarity, take initiative, and take full responsibility for your outcomes. Blindly following external systems guarantees loss on their terms. Strategic adaptability lets you control the game that observe the real rules of society. Public laws and norms often hide the true patterns of power. Watch who benefits, what is rewarded, and what is punished. Understand that lucidity matters more than morality. Acting decisively and calculating your moves is what creates real influence. Those who succeed are not always the most virtuous. They are the clearest, most strategic, and most effective. Results, not intentions, define authority. History remembers outcomes, not noble goals. Success, even born of necessity, earns respect. Failure, even with virtue, is often ignored. Focus on actions that produce real, measurable results. Control perception as well as outcomes. Victory gives voice and influence. Failure leads to silence. Resources, time, money, and energy are leverage, not charity. Invest strategically in people and situations that reinforce your power. Generosity without structure weakens influence. Generosity with purpose strengthens it. Finally, act decisively. Initiative separates leaders from followers. Waiting for permission or validation is surrender. Success comes from clarity, calculated action, and relentless focus on results. In the real world, justice is optional. Morality rarely decides, but consequences are predictable. The strongest men shape outcomes, protect resources, and control the game. In the end, power does not belong to the one who obeys blindly, speaks the most about virtue, or waits for fairness to save him. It belongs to the one who sees clearly, understands the hidden structure of the game, and acts with precision when others hesitate. Society may praise morality in words, but in practice, it rewards results, influence, and control. That is why the man who wants real power must stop thinking like a passive follower and start thinking like a strategist. He must observe deeply, move intelligently, protect his resources, and judge every action by the consequences it creates. Because those who only respect the rules remain limited by them, while those who understand when to use them, bend them, or rise above them are the ones who shape outcomes, command respect, and ultimately write the rules others are forced to follow.